Sarah Winters and Emily Parker were just two young women living ordinary lives in the small, peaceful town of Maple Creek until they vanished without a trace. What the town didn't know was that their disappearances were not a random tragedy, but the beginning of a twisted collection kept by someone no one ever suspected: Dr. Samuel Harrison, the beloved local psychiatrist. The discovery of their bodies would shatter the town's innocence and reveal a dark secret buried beneath years of trust and manipulation. How had a respected doctor become the mastermind of a chilling killing spree, and could anyone have seen it coming? In the summer of 2014, the small town of Maple Creek was like any other sleepy, Midwestern community. Nestled between rolling hills and shaded by towering oak trees, life moved at a leisurely pace. People knew each other by name, and most left their doors unlocked without a second thought. Crime was practically unheard of in this tight-knit town, and it had been years since anything even remotely suspicious had happened. But that all changed when Sarah Winters, a 22-year-old college student, disappeared without a trace one evening. Sarah had been walking home from the local library, just a few blocks from her apartment, when she vanished. She had planned to study for a big exam, but when she didn't come home that night, her friends started to worry. It wasn't like Sarah to skip plans or ignore texts. By morning, they called the police. The authorities responded quickly, launching a search, but they didn't find any signs of struggle, no dropped items, no trace of Sarah. Her phone was still in her apartment. Her car was parked out front, but she was gone. Initially, the case was treated as a missing persons report. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, spoke with Sarah's roommates, and combed through nearby parks and woods. Sarah's parents, frantic with worry, offered a reward for any information leading to her whereabouts. But as the days passed, the case grew colder. No one could pinpoint where Sarah had gone or who might have been involved. The police had no leads, and the town started to lose its sense of security. As the weeks stretched on, the search parties became fewer, and the investigation was gradually shelved. Then, just as Sarah's case was starting to slip from the public's mind, another disappearance occurred. Emily Parker, a 24-year-old waitress who worked at a local diner, disappeared in nearly the same manner. She, too, had been walking home from her shift on a warm evening, and she never arrived. Her family reported her missing the next morning. The police again searched the area, interviewing friends and neighbors, but there was no evidence of foul play. Emily's disappearance was eerily similar to Sarah's, and the eerie pattern started to set off alarm bells. The town of Maple Creek, once a quiet place where people felt safe, was suddenly on edge. Rumors swirled about the disappearances, and some residents began to whisper about a serial predator. Others suggested it might just be a tragic coincidence, a string of unrelated disappearances. But the fear was palpable. Parents warned their children to stay indoors after dark, and women avoided walking alone at night. Still, despite the mounting anxiety, the police seemed stumped. The cases were treated independently, with no clear connection made between the two women. But as more time passed without any significant breakthroughs, the town began to grow weary. No one knew it yet, but these disappearances would be the beginning of a much darker chapter in Maple Creek's history, one that would shake the community to its very core. What the police hadn't realized was that they were unknowingly standing on the precipice of something far more sinister. These weren't just random disappearances. They were the work of a killer who was hiding in plain sight, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to reveal the twisted extent of his actions. But for now, all they had were questions. And as Sarah's and Emily's cases grew colder, it seemed as though the truth might never be found. As the weeks passed since the disappearance of Sarah Winters, the town of Maple Creek began to settle into a quiet unease. Though the initial shock had faded, a sense of dread hung over the community like a dark cloud. People whispered about the what-ifs at the grocery store, at the post office, and in the local diner, but life carried on in the usual manner. That was until Emily Parker, the bubbly 24-year-old waitress who worked at the town's favorite diner, vanished in much the same manner as Sarah. Her disappearance, just 3 weeks after Sarah's, seemed to confirm the worst fears of the town. Someone was targeting young women in the most unsettling way. Emily had been well liked in Maple Creek. She had a bright smile and an easy laugh, always making customers feel at home in the small, family-run diner. She had no known enemies and a steady job, making her disappearance all the more shocking. Like Sarah, Emily was last seen walking home after her shift one evening, around 11 p.m. The walk from the diner to her apartment was less than a mile, but by morning, when Emily hadn't returned, her roommates grew frantic. They called her phone, checked with friends, and even drove around town hoping to find her. Nothing. No one had seen her, and no one knew where she was. The police, already deep into the search for Sarah, quickly pivoted to investigate Emily's case. Detective Jane Dawson, who had been leading the search for Sarah, was assigned to Emily's case as well. She found herself faced with a troubling realization: the two cases were too similar to be mere coincidences. Both women were in their 20s, both had been walking alone at night, and both had vanished without a single trace. Even more chilling, both had been seen walking through the same quiet neighborhoods, the same streets that had once felt so safe. Dawson couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far more sinister than a string of disappearances. The investigation unfolded quickly but uneventfully. As in Sarah's case, Emily's personal belongings remained untouched in her apartment. Her car was parked outside, and her phone was found on her nightstand. No signs of a struggle. The police scoured the town, knocking on doors, interviewing anyone who might have seen something, but nothing came forward. There were no CCTV cameras on the streets, and no one could recall hearing anything unusual. The silence from the community only deepened the fear. As the days passed, the possibility that these disappearances were the work of a serial predator began to sink in. The idea seemed almost impossible. This was Maple Creek, a town where crime was almost non-existent. But the pattern was undeniable. The longer Emily's case went unsolved, the more the town's paranoia grew. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed the disappearances were the work of an outsider who had entered the town. Others suggested the killer might be someone who had been living among them all along, someone with intimate knowledge of the town's rhythms and its people. The townspeople couldn't shake the feeling that a predator was lurking somewhere in the background, watching, waiting for his next opportunity. The local police, though doing their best, were becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. With 2 young women now missing, and no solid leads, the community was starting to feel like a pressure cooker, simmering with anxiety and fear. And then the whispers started. Had the 2 women known each other? Were their disappearances connected in some way? Though the authorities initially dismissed the theory, the residents of Maple Creek couldn't help but wonder if something darker was at play. One of Emily's old friends, who had seen her only a few days before her disappearance, mentioned something peculiar. Emily had recently started seeing a new therapist, Dr. Samuel Harrison, a psychiatrist in the town. This, combined with the fact that Sarah had also seen Dr. Harrison for a brief period, planted a seed of suspicion in Detective Dawson's mind. It seemed like an odd coincidence at first, but Dawson, knowing that nothing in a case like this could be ruled out, decided to investigate further. With a subtle, growing sense of urgency, Dawson began reviewing Dr. Harrison's records and making inquiries with his colleagues. The doctor came highly recommended, well respected in the community, and had even been a speaker at local events on mental health awareness. But Dawson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Was Dr. Harrison's involvement in both of these women's lives simply coincidental? Or was it possible that he had been more than just a therapist to them? The investigation into Dr. Harrison had begun quietly, but it would soon take a much darker turn. As Dawson dug deeper, the first cracks in the town's picture-perfect facade began to show. Dr. Harrison, who had been above suspicion for years, was starting to become the focal point of an investigation that threatened to unravel everything Maple Creek had known about itself. The days turned into weeks, and Maple Creek grew increasingly restless. The disappearances of Sarah Winters and Emily Parker had shaken the town to its core. Families locked their doors earlier at night, and the once bustling streets became eerily quiet as people grew more wary of walking alone after dark. The police, though diligent in their search, were no closer to finding answers. With each passing day, the sense of unease deepened. There were no leads, no witnesses, no surveillance footage that could provide even the faintest clue as to what had happened to these two young women. The town began to feel as though it were in the grip of an invisible force, an unseen predator that could strike at any time. It was during this tense period, when the case seemed to be going nowhere, that the breakthrough came. Officer Jack Harper, a veteran with the Maple Creek Police Department, was conducting a routine patrol when he received an unusual tip. A local teenager, who had been hanging out with friends in the woods on the outskirts of town, claimed to have seen something strange near an old, abandoned house. The house, located just off a dirt road at the edge of a wooded area, had been empty for years. It was a place that many locals avoided, as it was known for being a hangout spot for teens looking to party or get away from the watchful eyes of their parents. Harper had heard rumors about the house but had never investigated it himself. However, given the growing sense of danger in town, he decided it was worth a look. The officer drove out to the location and parked a short distance away, carefully approaching the house on foot. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The door, which had been boarded up for years, was slightly ajar. The teenager's report had been vague. He hadn't been able to describe exactly what he had seen, but something about this place felt different. Harper's instincts told him to proceed cautiously, even though he wasn't sure what he was expecting to find. When he opened the door, the smell hit him first, a musty, decaying odor that seemed out of place for a building that had been abandoned for so long. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. He moved slowly through the rooms, checking each one as he went. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just dust and old furniture. But as he entered the basement, something caught his eye. The door to the basement was slightly open, hidden behind a layer of thick, overgrown ivy that had crept up along the exterior of the house. He pushed it open, revealing a staircase leading down into complete darkness. Harper hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the flashlight, but something compelled him to go down. As he descended into the basement, he felt a strange sensation of dread creep up his spine. The basement was dimly lit by the faint beam of his flashlight. As he looked around, Harper's heart began to race. What he saw in that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. At first glance, the basement appeared to be nothing more than a cluttered storage space filled with old boxes, tools, and broken furniture. But as his light swept across the room, something chilling became apparent. The mannequins, dozens of them, were positioned around the room, arranged in strange and unnatural ways. But they weren't mannequins. Harper stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat as the true horror of what he was seeing became clear. The figures in the room were human bodies, each one in various stages of decay, their features frozen in grotesque, contorted positions. The bodies of Sarah Winters, Emily Parker, and several other women who had gone missing in recent years were arranged around the room like twisted works of art. Each one had been meticulously preserved and posed, some in lifelike positions, others in strange, unsettling postures that suggested they had been manipulated by the hands of someone with a disturbing obsession. Harper stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. The bodies, disfigured, decomposing, and eerily lifelike, were a chilling reminder of the brutal reality he had been trying to ignore. The disappearances were no coincidence. These women hadn't just gone missing, they had been murdered. But who could have done such a thing? And why? The investigation took an immediate turn. Harper called for backup, and soon the entire department was at the scene, carefully collecting evidence from the basement. The bodies were sent to the coroner for identification, and forensic teams scoured the property for any clues that might lead them to the killer. The authorities were no longer just investigating missing persons, they were now dealing with a serial killer, someone who had carefully selected his victims and kept them in this sickening collection for years. What began as a simple missing persons investigation had now escalated into a full-blown murder case. The discovery sent shockwaves through Maple Creek. The killer had been living among them, hiding in plain sight. The once peaceful town was now gripped by fear and disbelief. But the worst was yet to come. As the investigation deepened, the police were about to uncover a dark and twisted secret, one that no one could have ever imagined. The discovery of the bodies in the basement sent shockwaves through the small town of Maple Creek. The police, once unsure whether they were dealing with simple missing persons cases, now had a full-blown serial killer investigation on their hands. But even as forensic teams processed the evidence, the most terrifying realization had yet to come: the killer was still out there, and they had no idea who it was. The bodies found in the basement were carefully preserved, almost as if they were trophies, but they had been left untouched for months, if not years. This suggested that the murderer was not just a random predator, but someone who had a long history of meticulously planning and executing these killings. The investigation quickly shifted focus, narrowing in on individuals in the town who might have had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit such gruesome acts. As detectives pored over the victims' backgrounds and personal connections, they uncovered a chilling link that no one had expected. Among the residents of Maple Creek was a well-respected psychiatrist named Dr. Samuel Harrison. Dr. Harrison had been practicing in the town for over a decade, known for his calm demeanor, his reputation as a compassionate therapist, and his work with troubled individuals. He had treated a number of the missing women over the years, and several of them had even been patients at his clinic in the months leading up to their disappearances. At first, the connection seemed tenuous, but as investigators dug deeper, they discovered something unsettling. Dr. Harrison had been involved in the treatment of Sarah Winters and Emily Parker, the first two women to vanish. While his records were meticulous, the details of his treatment plans were troubling, and some of the sessions appeared to have gone beyond the bounds of normal therapy. Investigators learned that Dr. Harrison had a history of offering patients special treatments, some of which involved hypnosis and other manipulative techniques. He had become close to several of his patients, gaining their trust and their vulnerability. But it wasn't just the women who had been in his care. Dr. Harrison's office, when searched, revealed a disturbing collection of photographs and journals. The photographs depicted some of the women before they disappeared, often in candid, seemingly innocent poses, but with a subtle, unsettling undertone. The journals, filled with rambling notes, described a deep obsession with control, with breaking down his patients emotionally and ultimately possessing them. The words painted a chilling portrait of a man who saw himself as a savior, someone who could rescue his patients from their psychological struggles, but only at a terrible price. What disturbed investigators the most was the discovery of a secret room in Dr. Harrison's office, hidden behind a false wall. Inside the room, they found more disturbing artifacts, personal items from his patients' clothing, journals, even locks of hair, each one carefully labeled with the name of a woman and the date they had visited his office. It was clear that Dr. Harrison had been keeping meticulous records of his victims, treating them not as patients but as objects to be controlled and ultimately discarded when they no longer suited his twisted desires. As the investigation continued to unfold, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a horrifying way. Dr. Harrison had been grooming his patients for years, using his position as a trusted medical professional to gain access to their vulnerabilities. Once he had established complete psychological control, he would bring them to his secluded house or to the abandoned property where he kept his collection. There, he would manipulate them further, breaking them down mentally and emotionally until they were no longer able to resist his commands. The ultimate goal, it seemed, was not just to possess them, he wanted to keep them forever. Police began to suspect that the women were murdered not out of rage, but as part of a ritualistic obsession with death and control. Dr. Harrison's journals made it clear that he believed his collection was a way of immortalizing his victims, preserving them in death as he had never been able to do in life. The idea that someone who had appeared so normal, so respected, could harbor such dark, twisted thoughts was almost impossible to comprehend. With each new discovery, the case grew more complex, but it was also becoming increasingly clear that Dr. Harrison was the key to solving the mystery. The police quickly moved to arrest him, but as they gathered the evidence they needed, they learned something even more disturbing. Dr. Harrison had been planning his next move. The journal entries were full of names of women he had targeted, victims whose disappearances had not yet occurred, but were planned for the near future. Some of them had already been in his office for treatment, and some were close to the police, their lives intertwining in ways the authorities couldn't yet fully understand. As the authorities closed in on Dr. Harrison's location, they realized the true scale of the horror they were about to confront. The man they had trusted, whose calm, measured presence had reassured the town for so long, was not just a predator, but a master manipulator. He had woven himself into the very fabric of the community, hiding in plain sight, and now the police were about to uncover the full extent of his reign of terror. Dr. Harrison's arrest would mark the beginning of an even darker journey into his twisted mind, as investigators uncovered more victims and more chilling secrets, ones that would forever change the town of Maple Creek. The arrest of Dr. Samuel Harrison sent shockwaves through Maple Creek, a town that had prided itself on its peaceful, idyllic nature. As news spread of his involvement in the disappearances, residents struggled to comprehend how the man they had trusted for years could be capable of such horrors. In the weeks that followed, the police continued their investigation into Dr. Harrison's life, and what they uncovered was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The case would not only expose his long-running reign of terror in Maple Creek, but also uncover disturbing connections to disappearances in neighboring towns, revealing that Dr. Harrison's killing spree had stretched far beyond the small, quiet community. The initial investigation focused on the disturbing collection of photographs and journals found in Dr. Harrison's office. These items painted a portrait of a man with an obsessive need for control over his patients, women who had come to him for help but instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare of manipulation and psychological abuse. As police pored over his notes, they began to see patterns emerging. Each journal entry reflected a meticulously planned cycle, one that started with psychological manipulation, followed by a period of dependence, and eventually murder. But these entries also hinted at something even more disturbing. Dr. Harrison had not only been killing his patients in Maple Creek. His journals revealed a list of women from neighboring towns who had disappeared over the years, all linked to him in some way. The investigators were stunned. The more they examined the case, the clearer it became Dr. Harrison had been operating undetected for far longer than anyone had realized. His professional reputation, built over years of helping people with mental health issues, had provided him with the perfect cover. The women he targeted were vulnerable, often struggling with their own personal demons, making them easy prey for his calculated manipulation. He would gradually worm his way into their lives, offering them comfort, stability, and care, only to exploit their trust in the most horrific way possible. It was the discovery of one particular journal entry that proved to be the turning point. Hidden deep within the pages, Dr. Harrison had made a chilling confession. He had been photographing his victims during therapy sessions, capturing intimate moments under the guise of treatment. The photographs were not just of Sarah and Emily, but of other women from neighboring towns, each one taken in secret, often without the women's knowledge. The images were chilling in their simplicity, showing his victims in moments of vulnerability, their eyes haunted, unaware of the dark fate that awaited them. These photographs were meticulously stored, catalogued like trophies, each one documenting a twisted collection that stretched across years. As the investigation expanded, the authorities discovered more evidence of Dr. Harrison's long reach. The list of missing women, initially thought to be a coincidence, was far from it. A search of his personal records revealed a disturbing pattern. Women from nearby towns, some of whom had never been linked to Maple Creek before, had all been under Dr. Harrison's care at one point or another. Many of them had vanished shortly after their last appointments with him, their bodies never found until now. The police realized that the discovery in the basement had only been the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Harrison had been keeping his victims hidden away for years, collecting them like morbid works of art. But there was something even more chilling. In one of the boxes found at his home, investigators discovered a videotape that had been left hidden among personal belongings. The tape, when played, revealed a recording of Dr. Harrison speaking to one of his victims just before her death. His voice, calm and collected, sent shivers down the spine of anyone who listened. "You are always going to be part of my collection," he whispered, his words cold and devoid of any remorse. The victim, her face pale and lifeless, seemed to be the last in a series of his long, drawn-out manipulations. The tape was damning evidence, and it confirmed what investigators had suspected all along. Dr. Harrison's killings weren't crimes of passion, but the result of a twisted need for control and power. He saw his victims not as human beings, but as objects, as parts of a dark and personal collection that he could manipulate and preserve at will. But the most haunting discovery came just days before Dr. Harrison's trial. In the hidden room in his office, buried under layers of old files and paperwork, the police uncovered a final journal entry that outlined his plans for future victims. The names were unsettlingly familiar, women who had recently visited his office for counseling or therapy. The police feared that, had they not intervened when they did, Dr. Harrison would have continued his reign of terror, collecting more bodies and further embedding himself in the lives of his unsuspecting patients. As the trial of Dr. Samuel Harrison began, the town of Maple Creek found itself grappling with a new reality. The man who had once been a trusted figure in the community, a man who had helped so many people with their mental health struggles, was revealed to be a monster. The revelation of his crimes shattered the town's sense of safety and trust, and it took years for the wounds to begin to heal. Dr. Harrison was eventually convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But even as justice was served, the fear lingered. How many other towns had Dr. Harrison operated in, and how many more victims had there been? Maple Creek would never be the same. The quiet streets that once felt so safe were now imbued with a sense of horror, and the memories of the women who had been taken, those whose lives had been so cruelly manipulated, would never be forgotten. The discovery of Dr. Harrison's body collection had peeled back a layer of darkness that no one had ever suspected, leaving behind only questions and an overwhelming sense of unease.